Welcome back to The Week Ahead. The quest for truth and justice in South Africa's darkest chapter just hit yet another snag. The Khampepe Commission of Inquiry, established to investigate why apartheid-era prosecutions stalled, has been granted a major extension. President Cyril Ramaphosa has pushed the deadline to the for the final report back by several months, now due in July 2026. Well, that happens as earlier this week, two former South African police sergeants, Hercules Engelbrecht and Pieter were found guilty of the premeditated murder of student activist Caiphus Nyoka in 1987. But the administrative delay is fueling deep frustration and anger among the families of victims who have waited over 2 decades for closure of unresolved truth and reconciliation cases. President Ramaphosa says the extension to that commission and its timelines is to complete its work without any further delay and to provide the country with a full account of the circumstances that gave rise to the establishment of the commission. In the next few minutes, we are hoping to engage with Zaid Kimi from the Foundation for Human Rights, where Zaid is Executive Director. But we also have Nation Nyoka, who is a family member of the family of the late Caiphus Nyoka. Good afternoon, and thank you for talking to us this afternoon. Let me just start with that conviction of these two former SAPS police officers. What does it mean to you as a family that has waited this long to have a modicum of justice?
Thank you for your time. I think I'll start off with saying that, justice is the cornerstone of any democratic society, and the court proceedings on the 2nd of December are a step toward holding the perpetrators accountable, but there still needs to be more done in terms of restorative justice. And beyond the personal loss, it has been a reminder of the broader societal wounds that we carry as a society even today. So his case represents so many untold stories that haven't found justice, but it's also a painful reminder of the challenges that we still face in confronting our past. It's a critical step forward in terms of justice, of course. We are satisfied with the judgment, but of course we are still healing as a family. It's only part of the journey.
So tell me, have all the questions that you perhaps had around the motive and the circumstances around the killing of your uncle, have they all been answered in the course of this process that led to this conviction?
Not as yet. I think there's still a lot that needs to be disclosed, but I mean, this is also just a symbol of the ongoing quest for justice. As you mentioned, the Khampepe Commission, I think a lot will also come from there. But I mean, they had a chance during the TRC to divulge a lot of information. Even now, they were taken into confidence, and they didn't take us into confidence in terms of disclosing what had happened, particularly on that night, who was involved. As I've mentioned, although 9 bullets is what is recognized, the family pathologist all those years back found that it was 12 bullets. So we also still, as a family, require an explanation as to who fired the other 3 shots, who else was involved. Of course, they are the main figures of this, but there are masterminds behind the woodworks. There are also municipal officers who were involved. There were mayors who were involved. So that we'd also like disclosure in terms of that, full disclosure at that.
To someone who's an outside observer, that detail you just mentioned, the discrepancy between what has been found, that there were 9 bullets that killed him, and you as a family understanding that there were 12 bullets, it might sound like going down rabbit holes and unnecessarily getting bogged down in the details, but it matters to you as a family, doesn't it?
1000%. And I mean, outside of that, I think it's difficult to reconcile yourself in terms of that fact. Those bullets weren't necessarily bullets that don't really matter. They were sayings that it was self-defense. I'm glad that's been dispelled now. There were also false narratives in that regard, and that's why we also appreciated Murray's statement where he came out and said the bullets that he fired, or the number that he'd fired even as far back as the inquest in 1988. But those 3 bullets matter because they also completely dispel the narrative, the false narrative that is, that the police were acting in self-defense or that he had a weapon on him, which you've also seen now to be completely false. And this is part of the reason why when my grandfather passed on, he was incredibly He was incredibly dissatisfied, and he was completely disillusioned with the legal system because for him it didn't make sense why they would still try to tarnish his reputation, having already assassinated him so brutally.
Yeah, and then say a bit more. You talk about when you were mentioning the number of bullets, you're saying you would want to know who fired those three shots that are, according to you as a family, unaccounted for. Do you believe there were more people that were involved than these two that have now been convicted?
I think the family has had a long-standing conviction, and not one that's unfounded, that there were more people involved, people who we grew up seeing, people who came and asked for forgiveness from the family, but chose to shy away from the legal sphere, or even though we appreciate the legal process and have a respect for it, there are times where, of course, you can disagree with certain outcomes because you've had personal connections with people or had conversations with people who've admitted to their wrongdoing, but perhaps not within the legal sphere. So in that instance, I think that's part of the reason why the accused perhaps didn't take the stand, because they knew they'd have to account for certain things and have to explain how it is that they came about to get some of the information that they got. So there are things that we of course know, and there are things that the perpetrators know, which they haven't been fully forthcoming with.
Yeah. A common thread that runs through many of these stories of families seeking justice for apartheid-era crimes that were meant to have been followed through following the TRC is just the difficulty and the headwinds that these families are having to push against in order to obtain justice. Tell me about your journey as a family. You mentioned there was an inquest and the TRC, etc. But what has the journey been like to get to a point where a prosecutorial decision is made, and not only made, but actually followed through with an actual prosecutor standing up in court and charging these men?
Well, look, while the TRC offered, a platform for those who are willing to face their past, the absence of some perpetrators, of course, means that many truths remain hidden, but that doesn't mean that we stop seeking accountability. As I said, my grandfather's the one who first took this up, then passed on the baton to my aunt, who was the one who testified at the TRC alongside my grandmother, as well as Monica Wright, a family friend. And now that baton has been passed on to me. So that's about 3 generations that have been seeking justice. Forgiveness is quite complex. It's been a very harrowing experience. It's unearthed many traumas, and it's been a very deeply personal process. So while we may never forget what happened to my uncle, we also understand that, forgiveness is not about excusing the actions of the perpetrators, but also about freeing ourselves, liberating ourselves from that pain that holds us back. And for me personally, it's not just about granting amnesty, but acknowledging the hurt and finding a way to heal, because I also grew up in that environment. I only left that house when I was in my late teens going to university. But I grew up with my grandmother, who was deeply, deeply traumatized, not only by my uncle's death, but then the death of her husband subsequently. And it was just immensely disheartening, and even now unnerving, to be in court with men who have heard immensely worrisome stories about, people who have heard incredibly, incredibly disturbing stories about. And for them, it was just one night, but for my family, that's something that lives on and continues to play out in various ways. The way that they express their trauma also plays out in different ways. One of the witnesses who spoke, Mr. Kukunyakane, although I didn't know him personally, I also recognized the trauma that he went through, and he unfortunately never went for any type of therapy, as the judge mentioned, which is a complete contrast to those who perpetuated these crimes, who've had endless resources to forget essentially what they had done, claiming memory loss, for instance. You cannot sort of forget when somebody has tortured you and comes up to you and says, "I like your beard," for instance, intimidating the witness. Those things don't really sit well. So the lack of remorse from the perpetrators makes forgiveness even more difficult. But that's where I guess there is a reconciliation process must come into play.
Yeah. In terms of capturing what we're talking about, we've got a neat phrase. We call it the TRC's unfinished business. Earlier on in this conversation, you mentioned restorative justice. And I take it that's a feature of what you desire as a family. What does that look like for you?
Look, I think the TRC was important, but we need to look at broader mechanisms of justice. It's not enough to just have a truth-telling process. We need continued public pressure for accountability through both legal and societal means. There needs to be a concerted effort to find those who are still out there, to ensure that those who escape the TRC face consequences, and to support families in their healing. We also need to ensure that future generations don't repeat the mistakes of the past by addressing root causes and investing in things like education, human rights, and reconciliation. I cannot necessarily prescribe what that would look like, but I think it allows society as a whole to reimagine what that specifically looks like, using mechanisms that we currently have in place and reimagining new mechanisms that we can put in place.
Let me ask you then, as a final question, a parting shot, the circumstances of the establishment of the Khampepe Commission of Inquiry are controversial at the very least. The whole suggestion that whereas the TRC had recommended over 300 prosecutions of people who either failed to apply for amnesty or those who did not meet the requirements for amnesty in terms of the applicable law at the time, the democratic state may have, or some players in the democratic state may have frustrated these prosecutions. How much hope are you pinning on that the Khampepe Commission and its processes, given also these delays that have now been announced, the extension of the timelines, how much do you hope can still be recovered? Because we're talking about events that happened many, many years ago, and many of the people that potentially could have been prosecuted, I don't know, in 2002 are dead now.
I mean, I think what happened on the 2nd also gave us a renewed hope, and not just with our family, but with many other families. We've held hands with many families that felt aggrieved, and my aunt has said numerous times that we were incredibly fortunate that everything took place inside the home, so that it was easier in terms of accountability, in terms of witnesses, the fact that none of them have died as yet, which has been quite a saving grace in terms of moving forward. But there are families out there that don't know anything. There are families out there that are in the dark, that still have missing loved ones that they've never heard about, where the perpetrators have kept entirely quiet, despite being given the opportunity to. So outside of the limitations of the TRC, I think this is also quite a great platform for all of that to come to light. In terms of political interference as well, I think it'll also show that a lot more needs to be done, because this might just be the first step, but being as realistic as possible, 300 families is nothing in the bigger scheme of things. Many other families were affected. Admittedly, back in the day, politics was really not that popular. If you were a family that was political, you were in actual fact ostracized by many communities, because you would be the one that's the troublemaker family bringing in the police. But what I feel is that it brings a lot of hope. Despite these delays, we cannot be frustrated by delays. At the end of the day, like my family has continued to do over the past 38 years, we need to remain steadfast that the truth will come out, and that we can move forward with hope that there will be some sort of accountability and justice. That's the only way the country can fully heal and move forward with no mistakes going forward that are repeated.
All right, I've got to thank you for sharing your time with us this afternoon and the sentiments and your own reflections as a family. That's Nation Nyoka, who is a family member of the late Caiphus Nyoka, talking to us there in the wake of the conviction of 2 former SAP police officers for Nyoka's murder in 1987.